Hey there everybody, it's Mark Crowley. I'm back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about sound effects in comic books. I'm going to be giving you my best advice on how to use them, how to work them into your own stories. And as my primary examples, I'm going to be using my own graphic novel series, Brody's Ghost and Miki Falls. But to begin with, I want to make a little comparison between American comics and Japanese manga and see if we can spot any differences between the way sound effects are used in these two different countries. So hang on a second, I'm going to go ahead and get an American comic book to get started with that. Okay, so this is Star Wars Tales, a collection by my publisher Dark Horse, and I've found what I hope is a fairly typical spread here that shows the traditional use of sound effects in American comics. Thoom, choom, cham, and fashum, you know, these are all these explosion sound effects. And I gotta say, the way I use sound effects is fairly similar to this, in the sense that these words that you see are not actual words that you would find in the dictionary. More on that later. But this sort of shows you the American approach, and I would just point out that in some comics, especially in recent years, the sound effects appear to be added on top of the artwork by way of computer programs rather than drawn by hand. That's just sort of a technical thing, and you know, I don't know if you need to pay too much attention to that, but I do think it has some effect on the way the comics are drawn, if indeed you are trying to work the sound effect into the artwork rather than drop it on later on with a computer program. I myself am almost always adding the sound effect into the artwork, you know, with the pen and ink that begins the process. Well, let's go ahead and compare this style with the Japanese style. All right, well, let's begin with a kind of an old school example. This was published in 1994. You can see the sort of yellowed pages. But the main thing I'm noticing is just more sound effects in use throughout the spread. They're all over the place. In fact, here's a panel where it's really only sound effects. And it's not just the fighting, punching sound effects that we're getting. There's a place here where they're panting. Let me zoom in here. I don't want to go out of focus. But these guys right here are sort of like, you know, breathing from the exertion of this fight. So I would just say, as a general principle, you know, hate to generalize about these things because people will argue with me about it, but I do believe, in general, the Japanese are using sound effects more frequently. Let me go ahead and get a more recent example. All right, well, I said more recent, but actually this is from 2004, so, you know, maybe not all that much more recent. But here we see sound effects for the beating heart, dokin, dokin, dokin. You know, I think a lot of American comic artists would never include a sound effect for the heartbeat of a character. And as I was saying, you just are seeing sound effects throughout the page, all over, you know, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, all these different sound effects. And almost every panel has some sort of a sound effect. So I think it's safe to say that Japanese manga creators are making more use of sound effects than Americans are. In fact, in that other Dark Horse collection of Star Wars comics, I could show you that some artists don't use them at all. They just they don't like the use of sound effects in America, some artists, and they will just do an entire story with none in it, just leaving the sound effects to your imagination. I think it would be pretty hard to find an example of a Japanese comic that has no sound effects in it. Although Death Note, I noticed, is pretty sparing in its use of sound effects. Anyway, let me show you one more example of manga-style sound effects. Okay, well, this is from Keroro Gunso, and I wanted to show you at least one example of what I would call jokey sound effects. And here we see this this dong, you know, and sort of popped out, and it's clearly not intended to be taken too seriously. And I think it's interesting that you can kind of differentiate between serious sound effects and jokey sound effects. This one looks like a jokey one to me. These over here look more like standard, you know, serious sound effects that you might see in a more serious story. Let me show you one more thing from a Keroro Gunso. Okay, so here's a sound effect, zubasha, and it's sort of interesting that they have split it into two separate halves. This happens quite frequently in Japanese comics, I think way less frequently in American comics, where we tend to keep the word as a single unit on the page. You know, I could go on and on comparing Japanese and American comics, but the real point of this video is to give you some specific advice about using sound effects in your own comics. So let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so this is from Brody's Ghost, Book 1, and it maybe sounds a little too obvious to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Don't forget that the main purpose of sound effects is to make the reader hear a particular sound while they're reading. I think sometimes you might start to just toss them in as a decorative thing, maybe, and you really do have to keep in mind that each sound effect is supposed to cause the reader to hear a particular sound. So here's a simple one. Brody's walking across his kitchen floor to the refrigerator, and I wrote here, shup, shup, shup. Okay, so I gave a little bit of thought to this. What word will convey this feeling of lazy walking, of sort of sliding your feet across the floor as you walk? And, you know, I wish I could tell you some sort of magical process by which you come up with these words, but really it's just playing around with letters, consonants, and vowels until you find a combination that registers in your mind as the sound you're looking for. So here he's opening the door, cree, you know, and that K-R-E-E-E-E-E is what popped into my head, and one that I use quite frequently for a creaking door. So that's, you know, tip number one, make sure that you are focused on the particular sound that you're trying to convey, and don't be satisfied until you've come up with the word that you think really puts it across. Let's move on to the next bit of advice. Okay, so this is from Brody's Ghost, Book 3, and it really just comes down to personal preference, but I don't like to use dictionary words as sound effects. We have Brody here ringing a doorbell. I could have written ding dong, which is, of course, the standard doorbell sound effect in English. But I decided to break away from that, and just by getting rid of the D's and replacing them with T's, we end up with these newly invented words that seem more like sound effects to me and not like words that you could look up in the dictionary. Kachak is another one that I use for a door opening and closing. And you'll find over time, as you invent more and more sound effects, that you'll have ones that you can reuse. Pretty much any time I have someone opening or closing a door, I go right back to this same sound effect. All right, so the size of the lettering is directly related to the volume that you intend this sound effect to have. So I wanted this to be a very large sound, and I made it absolutely gigantic. It's probably the largest single sound effect in the entire series. But that shows you just how big you can go if you want to. Now let me show you the opposite extreme. So here you see much smaller lettering for this sound effect, swit, as he picks an object up off the table. And, you know, if I had written swit with these gigantic letters, that would have been kind of bizarre, you know. So it's just always something you're thinking about. You consider the volume that you want the reader to hear this sound at, and then that is directly related to how large or small you make the sound effect. So in addition to the size of the lettering, you have the font, I guess you would call it, that you're using. Although I'm not using a font, I'm writing this by hand. I wanted the sound to change in its tone, basically, from the first part to the second part. This is a truck pulling up, and so the sound effect is supposed to go screep, you know, and so I used this very sharp-edged lettering for the scree part, and then more of a rounded lettering for the psh part, and that way, hopefully, the reader gets a clear idea of what I'm going for. So always consider the shape of your lettering before you write your sound effect. Okay, so you've got the size of the lettering to play around with, as well as the shape of the individual letters, but also the shape of the entire word can play a role. Here I wanted this suggestion of blowing wind, and so I took the entire word, which is as simple as the letter F and the letter O, and I gave the whole word this sort of S-curve shape. And so I think that accentuates this idea of the blowing wind. So that's one final thing that you consider before writing your sound effect in there. What shape does the entire word have? I'm a big believer in getting the sound effect as close to its source as possible. So here we see Brody striking a match, and I get this sound effect, fitch, almost like an arrow pointing right towards the match that created the sound. I believe that that's really the best way to do it. You don't want your reader to be confused as to what you're going for with this sound effect. In passing, I can point out that this word here has no vowels. Well, that's one of the nice things about inventing your own sound effects. They don't have to follow the rules of dictionary words. You can spell it any way you want. It's your word. You invented it. Okay, so this is from Miki Falls, and it's a little related to this idea of the size of the letters conveying the volume of the sound. But you can have a single sound or a single repeated sound grow in volume by writing it larger and larger. Here we have my go-to sound for someone walking or running, this chep, chep, chep sound. Anyone who's read my comics has seen me use this a lot. But notice how it starts small, and so you hear this kind of chep, 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 as he's running, and we almost feel like he's coming closer to us. And, of course he is. He's seen as farther away here, and he's closer here, so the sound effect is really helping us get this idea of him running towards us, coming out of the page. Notice also that I took the word crash, again, a pretty standard sound effect word, and by changing the letter C to a K, we just break a little bit away from that standard dictionary spelling and create something that stands alone as more of a real sound effect. Okay, so here I wanted to show you that sometimes you can use sound effects to convey information that's not actually shown in the comic. Here we have this woman. She's peering through her door, got the chain going across. And in this panel, the sound effects really kind of tell the story. Ka-chak tells us that the door closed. The shik-a-shik, in my mind, tells us that she unhooked that chain. And then cree, once again, my sound effect for a creaking door. These three sound effects are really, a very important part of that sequence in terms of conveying information. So keep that in mind. You can create a sort of a cinematic effect by using sound effects for things that the reader can't even see happening in the story. Okay, so here I wanted to point out the importance of coordinating your sound effects with your dialogue. At this point in the story, I wanted Brody's speech to be interrupted by his own coughing, so I have him say, "I'll do anything you ask," right, with the cough, cough. Incidentally, another one where I've taken the spelling of the word cough and altered it to turn it into a sound effect. But you can imagine if the cough, cough had been up here somewhere, we would not necessarily know that his sentence was interrupted by the coughing. Is it crucial to the story? Not necessarily, but this is the way I heard it in my mind, and I wanted to make sure that the reader heard it that way as well. Here's another example of a sound effect working with a word balloon. Here Brody says, "If I can just get to Stradley Park, ka-chak," and the ka-chak sound is literally interrupting what he's saying. This I spoke of in an earlier video, but I do believe that when you want one thing to interrupt another, you've got to get them really close together to assist in the sort of immediacy of one sound overlapping the other. Okay, so this is my 10th and final piece of advice, and maybe a slightly odd one to include in such a video, but you should always consider the possibility of there being no sound effect if you feel that you don't need one. So here we see once again my chep, chep, chep sound as someone is running, and a thump as she launches herself into the air, a sort of a sound as she sails through the air, and then the big climactic moment. She smashes through the window, but I decided not to include any sound effect. A couple of reasons. I didn't want to interrupt this image by putting words in front of it, but maybe more importantly, I almost wanted this Hollywood movie effect of suddenly the volume cuts out and we hear nothing at all. And that can sometimes be just as effective as putting some gigantic lettering in there to sort of hammer home the idea of this big sound. So, yeah, consider the possibility of deliberately withholding a sound effect at certain points in the story. And that's about it for this video. I just wanted to point out that if you found this stuff interesting, there is a section in Mastering Manga that talks about sound effects as well as giving all kinds of other information about manga and comic book creation. But I think it is time to wind down this video. Thank you so much for watching it, and I do apologize for this not being a how to draw video. I'll definitely be back with one of those next week. But till then, thanks again for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.